get somebody else to write it for you. Oh. Good to have all of you back this evening. We're going to be looking at a lesson we've entitled Demas, taking a character out of the New Testament to study, looking at things that happened in the life of Demas, things that we can learn from. I invite you to open your Bibles to 1 John chapter 2 to begin with. We'll look at a passage there that you're very familiar with, I know. There in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. 1 John 2, 15 through 17. Here the writer says, "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, the pride of life is not of the Father, but of the world. The world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever." There's several things in that passage that stands out, but one thing that stands out most clearly is the fact that we must not love the world. And of course, that's talking about the things of the world, the things that are out there that the world presents for our enjoyment, the things out there that entices us, the things out there that moves us. You know, emotion is a very powerful thing, whether it be love, hate, or even indifference. Whatever that emotion is, it's very strong. And emotions moves us from one thing to another. As we talked about this morning, we need to make sure that we choose that which is right. Make sure that we do the things that are right. And of course, as we look at this, it's telling us to make sure that we do not choose those things that are out there in the world. Love is a wonderful thing if it is channeled to the right thing, if it's channeled in the right direction. And the subject of our study this evening is one that allowed his love for things to move him away from where he ought to be. Demas is an individual that made wrong choices. And the thing we have to understand about Demas before we even get into the lesson, here's a man that knew what was right and he knew what was wrong. He had spent lots of hours traveling with Paul and Silas, Timothy and Luke and others. He was one that had been involved in the work of the church. He had been involved in the evangelism of the gospel. But as we look at this tonight, I want us to look at him and get some lessons from this man Demas. Things we can make sure we do and things that we need to make sure that we stay away from. First of all, let me ask the question, who was Demas? Who was Demas? Well, you know, we don't know a lot about Demas, do we? We don't know a lot of things that are said about this man, Demas. What we have in the Bible, the totality of our understanding him is mentioned. His name is found 3 times in 3 scriptures in all of the Bible. But even though that name is only found 3 times throughout the Bible, we can deduce a lot of things from his life. We can know a lot of things about him. You know, once he was interested in evangelism. Once he was interested in the souls of others. Once he was interested in his own soul. But things began to change. You know, as we look at these verses, and we're going to look at all of these verses here in a moment, but let me just mention a couple to you right now to show that he was, at one time, he was once interested, he was once in that relationship with God, he was in fellowship with those men who were going around, who were teaching the gospel to those that are lost. In Colossians chapter 4 and verse number 14, the Bible here says, "Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you." So there is a verse that tells us that he was traveling with Luke, the beloved physician. And then in Philemon, verse 24, there it mentions Marcus or Chippus, Demas, Lucas, my fellow laborers, it says. There is Demas, mentioned in those 2 verses. Once he was a companion of Luke. Then it talks about him not only being a companion with these other people, but it says he is a fellow laborer. Well, what does that tell you about him? Even though, as I said, his name is only mentioned 3 times. Those 2 verses tell us a lot about him. What he was, what he stood for, where he was in his relationship with God and the gospel of Jesus Christ. A fellow laborer. That word fellow laborer is a word that means companion in labor, laboring together with, a fellow worker. And that's meaning he was one who was involved in the teaching. He was involved in the carrying out of the gospel. And one of the things you can know about that is the fact that he went with these men who are listed. And we know that there was great persecution that came upon these people. So for a time, he went even in the face of those persecutions. But if I go to 2 Timothy chapter 4, look at what that says to us. Now keep in mind what we just read about him back over there in those other verses. But now let's go to 2 Timothy. When we go to 2 Timothy, and we're going to notice there in chapter 4. Now, in chapter 4, in verse number 10, we find something about it. Now, let's read verse number 9, where Paul is writing to Timothy, and he says, "Do thy diligence to come shortly unto me. For," now, stop there just for a second. Notice what Paul has said. Paul has talked to Timothy about preaching the gospel, being instant, in season, out of season, reproving, rebuking, exhorting with all long-suffering and doctrine. He went on to say, "The time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give unto me at that day. And not to me only, but unto all them that love his appearing." Now, Paul is writing this knowing that his death is close by. But then, as I said, we come there to verse number 9. He says, "Do thy diligence to come shortly unto me." Why? Why was Paul wanting Timothy to come? Well, notice it says there in verse number 10. It says, "For Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica, Crescens to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia." Notice what it says about Demas. Now, we just read 2 verses. You know, I said that he's mentioned 3 times, 2 times in a good light, but Paul closes out the writing about Demas by saying, "Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world." Can you imagine the agony that was in the mindset of the Apostle Paul as he was in distress, knowing his departure was close by, and he said, "Come to me quickly, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world." A person you know that Paul loved greatly. He loved dearly. But he says, "He has left me. He has forsaken me." Why? Why does it say that Demas had forsaken Paul, having loved this present world? Now, I don't know all I'd like to know about that verse, and I'll not ever know all of the things that are involved in that verse until eternity, in that time frame. But one of the things I believe we can surmise is the fact that Paul was under heavy persecution. Demas was leaving because he loved the things of the world. He loved his life more than he loved the gospel of Jesus Christ. You could not help but think, as you write by that verse, you ought to write down Revelation 2:10. Because in Revelation 2:10 it says, "Be thou faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of life." Demas was not after the crown of life at that point. He was after the things of the world. Remember what we read in 1 John 2:15 through 17? "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world." But Demas, I believe when it says, having forsaken me, or he has forsaken me, having loved this present world. The word forsaken means to be in willful desertion. Robertson Word Picture calls it willful desertion. He went away of his own choice. And to forsake, when you look at it, if you want to look at it very carefully, to forsake the truth is to oppose the truth. To fall in line with error. When I forsake the truth, what else do I have? What else do I have to hold on to? What else is there for me? Nothing but error. I can't say, well, I'm leaving the truth, but I'm going to be neutral. I'm not going to be involved in anything. Well, when you've done that, you've gone into error already. So when you come back and look at this, to forsake is to oppose. To oppose the truth. Yes, it is. It's to oppose the truth. Somebody says, well, I don't say anything against the truth. I'm just not doing anything by my lifestyle, I am in opposition to the truth. Because I have requirements. God has given me commandments. He's given you commandments to help others to live according to the truth. Matthew chapter 5, 13 through 16. Especially there in verse number 16, we remember when He says, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. When I leave the truth, I can no longer let my light shine before men because I no longer have the light. So by leaving the truth, I put out my light and I'm now walking in darkness. Walking in darkness, I'm not in fellowship with God. That's where Demas went. He went into darkness when he walked away from the Apostle Paul. In Luke chapter 11, verse 23, there the Lord said, he that is not with me is against me, and he that gathereth not with me scattereth. He that is not with me is what? Is against me, the Lord said. There was not a middle place. The Lord didn't say he was not with me. Doesn't necessarily have to be against me. He can be neutral. But the Lord said, if you're not with me, you're against me. In Proverbs 28, verse number 4, there it says, they that forsake the law praise the wicked. That's a powerful statement. They who forsake the law praise the wicked. Because there's not but two places we can be. There's only two positions that we can be in. Who was Demas? Well, first of all, we can say Demas was a man who left his first love. He had been in love with the gospel. He had been in love with the truth. He had been in love with the things involved in that. And he had been involved in that for a long, long period of time. But his actions demonstrated his lack of love for truth. Now listen, when he demonstrated his lack of love for the truth, he demonstrated his lack of love for the Lord. John 14 verse 15 says, if you love me, keep my commandments. If I won't keep the commandments, and Demas, as I said, he went away of his own will, knowing exactly what he had, where he had been, what he had been involved with. And he said, I'm through with that. I'm no longer going to be involved with that. I don't want that anymore. Have you ever known anybody like that? I have. And it's a sad thing to talk to someone and they say, I don't want that anymore. Or they'll say to you, I know what you're going to say, so just don't say it because I've heard it 1,000 times. Just keep it to yourself. When you look at the things that we find, 1 John 2, verse number 5, there the Bible says, but whoso keepeth his word, in him verily is the love of God perfected. Hereby know we that we are in him. How? By our love. Love for him, love for the truth. Love for being involved in the things of the truth. Paul must have been amazed to know that this man was leaving him. I thought about this. I just wonder. I say this a lot. Sometimes a preacher has too much time all by himself and he goes to thinking a lot. But when I was doing this, I thought about this one point here. Paul must have been amazed at his desertion. And I thought, you think Demas came to him and said, Paul, I'm through with this. You're on your own now. I don't want any more of this. Or do you think he just snuck out as in the middle of the night? Whichever way, Paul must have been hurt deeply. Not only because the man was leaving the work that needed to be done, but because the man was losing his soul. He was stepping away from that which would bring him to salvation. Paul would say in Galatians 1 verse number 6, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you unto the grace of Christ unto another gospel. Paul said, I marvel, I'm amazed that you are so soon removed from the gospel, that you left, that you turned away from the truth. Demas was a man who stopped short. You know, you can run a race. A person might enter a race. He says, I want to run in this race. You know what? He can never win until he crosses a finish line. Demas did not cross the finish line of victor. Now, Demas is going to cross a finish line. We don't read any more about him. Some people said, well, with all the knowledge he had, he probably repented and came back. Well, certainly I don't know that. But the Bible doesn't speak about it. It just simply talks about his going away, how he had forsaken the Apostle Paul for the things of the world. Whatever that might have been. It might have been to get away from persecution. It might have been because there was a temptation that came to him that he could not throw off. I've known people who were tempted at things and ultimately they just simply gave in to them. Fight them for a while, go on at them for a while, deal with them for a while, and then finally they say, I'm tired of fighting. And just give themselves over to that temptation. Whatever the cause was, Demas left the Lord. In Hebrews 12, verse 7, the Bible there says, if ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? And then also in James 5, verse number 11, the Bible here says, behold, we count them happy which endure. And then it goes on to say, you have heard of the patience of Job and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. Happy are you if you endure, if you stay till the end. You know, we must not be like Demas. We must not let the world pull us away. You know, I can think back on, in the years I've been preaching, I can think back and name person after person after person after person that left the church and went back into the world. For what reasons? I don't know all of them. They've told me some. But the point, it really is this. They have left that which will bring them true happiness. The things of the world will not, as our text said. Love not the things of the world, neither the things that are in the world, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, that's not of the Father. It's of the world. And then it says, the world passeth away, and the lust thereof. But he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. You know, people in this lifetime sometimes trade their soul for a short period of joy, of pleasure, and then spend eternity in a vast, unending time lost because they left their first love, because they forsook the truth and went into the world. You know, this love affair that Demas had cost him dearly. It cost him everything, didn't it? I mean, this morning in our lesson we talked about doing right. And I asked you the question, what do you know about Demas? I would venture to say that most of us remember what's seen in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 10. Demas hath forsaken me. Why? Because that's the very last thing we know about him. That's the thing that is going to be written down. Not all the good thing that he did. On Judgment Day, the Lord is not going to say, okay, you left, but I'm going to count all those years that you followed Paul and Timothy and Silas and Luke. It's going to be what was the last thing in your life. And that's what Demas, that's the legacy that Demas has left. Well, let's look at a couple of lessons, then we'll close tonight. Well, what lessons do we learn? Well, the first is very obvious. We have to maintain our faithfulness at all cost. We have to be faithful to the Lord no matter what. Revelation 2:10. Make sure that you're faithful all the way to the end, and you'll receive a crown of life. Don't give up. Don't let the things of the world pull you down. You know, one of the reasons a lot of people are pulled down by the things of the world? Because they don't have close association with their brethren in the church. That's the truth. We see each other on Sunday, and some on Wednesday. But we're pulled into the world because we don't associate ourselves with those who are striving to be faithful. You know, another thing that Demas teaches us, and I mean this flies in the face of denominationalism. What's one of the doctrines of the denominational world? Of Calvinism. Once saved, always saved. Demas proves that is a false doctrine. Here was a man who was a Christian. How do you know he was a Christian, Toney? Because Paul said he was a fellow laborer. Paul didn't say he was a phony. Paul said he was a fellow laborer. That he had been with those folk. That he had been involved in the things with them. But he left and forsook the truth to go back into the world. Once saved, always saved is proven to be false in that he was a saint, but then he went back into the world. Another thing that I think we need to learn and understand. The pull of the world is strong. Brethren, the pull of the world is powerful. It has all the things that we look to. We talk about the wealth and fame and the beauty and the greatness of the things of the world. If we're not careful, who are our heroes? Young people, who are their heroes? Those people who are in the entertainment business, the singers, sports figures. My, why would they be a hero to anyone? But if we're not very careful, we're going to be pulled back into the world because that stands there before us and it looks so wonderful. You know, have you ever thought about it? If sin, if you could see exactly what sin was, see how ugly that it really is, who would want to be a part of it? If you could recognize what it will cause to happen to your soul. You know, somebody said one time, if you could just crack open the door to hell and look just for one moment into what hell will be like, people would run from it. Well, brethren, the Bible has cracked open the door. It has described what hell is like, where there's weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. Fire and brimstone, a fire that does not go out. But then you can also crack the doors open into the beauty of heaven. And you have a choice that you can make. Demas made the wrong choice. Demas did not do the right thing. he left Paul to go back into the world. And what do we have to do? We have to be prepared to overcome those temptations that are there before us. And, we have to really be prepared before we ever face the temptation. You know that? We have to be ready to turn ourselves aside, to eschew evil before we ever come face to face with it. But sometimes we're not prepared for that. Sometimes, as I said, we let the beauty of the world. It tells us in Hebrews chapter 11 there, the beginning of that chapter, something about Moses. Moses chose to suffer with his people for a season rather to enjoy, or rather to have the beauty of being good for a time frame, for eternity, rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Moses wanted that which was eternal, not that which was temporal. We make a choice. We can be like Demas, or we can be like Paul. There are two people in that. And Paul is one that says, I am now ready to be offered. Demas said, I'm not ready to be offered. It's not in my near future. I don't want that. So the choice has to be made. What are you going to do with the rest of your life? Please don't. And someday down the road, somebody say, they were one time faithful to the Lord, but now they're in the world. Our journey to eternity, to that heavenly home, begins with our obedience to the gospel. And we maintain that by keeping on obeying the gospel. We hear, we believe, repent, confess, and are baptized. And then we're faithful all the way to the end of our life, not loving the pleasures of sin for a season. If you need to respond, we invite you to do it as together we stand and sing.